Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahid Jurjan. This is Biblical History, the story of God's work through the ages. Today we're talking about Lesson 4, which will discuss conquest and the promised land. Out of the chaos of the ancient world and the rebellion at Babel, God selected one man of faith named Abraham. Through him, the Lord would inaugurate his rescue plan for humanity. God swore to give him land, a great nation, and that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Abraham's descendants had to relocate to Egypt to escape a great famine, but the move was all part of God's plan. Centuries passed, and the Egyptians turned to cruelty, oppressing and enslaving the Israelites because they feared how numerous they had become. In response, God raised up the deliverer, Moses. 10 plagues devastated Egypt. The power and name of Yahweh was manifest. God shepherded the people through the Red Sea and drowned the Egyptian army, which was in pursuit. Moses led the people to Mount Sinai, where he mediated the law and helped to bind the people to God through a covenant. The covenant watchword was spoken by the Lord. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Exodus 6 and verse 7. The book of Exodus concludes with the construction of the tabernacle, which was a portable, elaborate tent structure. The tent signified God's presence among his people, and it's where Israel would gather to worship the Creator. God's glory filled the tent, and when it was time for Israel to break camp, the glory cloud would exit the tabernacle and move forward, beckoning the people to follow. The third book of the Bible, Leviticus, is a fascinating catalog of various laws and instructions for Israel, and especially the Levites and priests. The opening chapters describe different types of sacrifices the people were to offer at the tabernacle. Now, animal sacrifice is an important biblical theme. The Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary provides this explanation. The burnt, grain, peace, sin, and guilt offerings compose the basic sacrificial system of Israel. These sacrifices were commonly used in conjunction with each other and were carried out on both an individual and a corporate basis. The sacrificial system taught the necessity of dealing with sin and, at the same time, demonstrated that God had provided a way for dealing with sin. Every time worshipers or priests would slit the throat of the offered animal, seeing the blood drain out, they would be reminded that the wages of sin is death. Since life is in the blood, according to Leviticus, the shed blood of the innocent animal was accepted by God as that which purifies and cleanses the defilement brought about by sin. And that's how sin is pictured in Leviticus. It defiles everything it touches: the people, the priests, the tabernacle, the land itself. So blood was offered to atone or to cleanse that defilement in the people, the tabernacle, and over the land itself. And this powerful symbolism made atonement for Israel's transgression. But of course, its truest and most ultimate purpose was to point forward to the greatest possible sacrifice for sin, the death of the Lord Jesus Christ on the cross. As Paul writes, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. Romans 3 and verse 25. The book of Leviticus also documents the ordination of Israel's priests. Now, the priests were ministers of the tabernacle. They served in God's presence. They were charged with overseeing Israel's sacrificial system, as well as being guardians of the Mosaic law. God originally intended for all Israelites to be priests before him, according to Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. However, after the people rebelled and worshiped the golden calf, God selected just one tribe of the Levites to become the nation's priests and tabernacle workers. Aaron, who was Moses' brother, was the first high priest who was given special responsibilities in the tabernacle services, especially during Israel's most important and sacred day, the Day of Atonement, that once-a-year celebration and sacrifice when the high priest would bring the blood of the offered lamb directly into the most holy place to cleanse it from the defilement of the previous year's sins. Now, at Mount Sinai, the people entered into their covenant with God. The tabernacle was built. The Torah, the instructions of God, the law were revealed, and the priests were consecrated to their holy service. Okay, now what? Well, now it's time to take this new nation of God's people to their home, the land that God promised to give Abraham and his descendants. Israel's journey from Sinai to the Promised Land is recorded in the fourth book of the Bible, the book of Numbers. And what should have only taken a few months of journeying and traveling through the wilderness turned into a 40-year nightmare. See, as the camp of Israel approached the borders of Canaan, Moses dispatched 12 men, one representative from each of the 12 tribes, to spy out the land, and he gave them these instructions. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? And are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. And then there's this parenthetical, it was the season for the first ripe grapes. Numbers 13, verses 19 and 20. After 40 days of investigation, the 12 returned to the camp. They delivered the massive cluster of grapes Moses had requested, and the first thing they stated in their report was amazing. They said, "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit." Numbers 13:27. In other words, everything God said about Canaan was absolutely 100% true and accurate. It is a bountiful and good land. Now, this news should have caused an outpouring of joy and celebration, jubilee throughout the camp. Since they left Egypt for the desert, the Israelites had been constantly complaining about how hard it was to journey under such difficult conditions. There's no water, there's no food, and now they're on the precipice of an abundant land, which the mighty God of the Exodus promised to give them. Tragically, the spies had more to report. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large." Numbers 13:27 and 28. Two of the 12 spies, Joshua and Caleb, tried to encourage the people that they could succeed in this invasion because, after all, God was with them. But their 10 companions persisted in their negativity. "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." Numbers 13:31. The Israelite camp burst into tears, wailing throughout the night. Then they protested against Moses and Aaron, saying, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land, only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? We should choose a new leader and go back to Egypt." Numbers 14:2-4. Moses and Aaron were devastated, and of course so was God. The Lord said that their rebellion was the result of a lack of faith. They did not believe in Him. In spite of what they'd seen in Egypt, they did not trust in God's plan to take the land. They surveyed the situation with their physical eyes, seeing nothing but giant warriors and fortified cities. But God wanted them to look through the eyes of faith, to know that He is able to fulfill His promises no matter how difficult the obstacles may seem. The punishment for this unbelief was 40 years of wilderness wandering. The faithless generation died in the desert. God only spared Joshua and Caleb, the loyal spies. Even Moses and his siblings, Aaron and Miriam, would perish before the conquest of Canaan because of their own acts of rebellion, which are documented later in the book of Numbers. Now, just before his death, after 40 years in the desert, Moses delivered a series of speeches to the new generation, and these discourses are recorded in the 5th book of the Bible, Deuteronomy. Moses essentially called on the next generation to succeed where their parents had failed, to trust in God's plan, to be faithful to the covenant, and to serve the God of Israel, Yahweh, the Lord who delivered them from Egypt, with every fiber of their being. Moses ordained Joshua to replace him as Israel's new leader, and finally, the deliverer climbed Mount Nebo, overlooking the promised land, and he died at the command of God. A later editor wrote these words about Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Deuteronomy 34, verses 9 through 12. The book of Deuteronomy is essential. It's a turning point as Moses prepared Israel to do what they had previously deemed as impossible, to go into a land that was entirely polluted by sin and idolatry, a place where the Canaanites even sacrificed their sons and daughters on altars before their false gods, and by the power of the Lord to transform that land into a new Eden, a place that was abundant, teeming with life, a place of peace and rest. God would deliver them from the hands of their enemies, and he would take that land and transform it into a new Eden land where God could dwell among his people. That was the plan that God had in store for the Israelites if they listened to his voice and kept his covenant. Now, the next book of the Bible, which is book number 6, is Joshua. And Joshua resumes right where Deuteronomy closes, with the death of Moses and the transfer of power to Joshua. The book of Joshua documents how a group of emancipated slaves who just spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness were able to defeat the giants of Canaan and sack their fortified cities. How did they do it? Well, this is what God said to Joshua. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Joshua 1, verses 5 and 6. God demonstrated his powerful presence in the very first battle Israel fought against the city of Jericho. Jericho was a walled city, and the Israelites had no siege equipment. So God told them simply to march around the city, blow some trumpets, and shout loudly. And this is a pretty unorthodox battle plan for sure, but it worked. On the last day of marching, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. Joshua 6 and verse 20. The rest of the book of Joshua documents more of the same, how God led Israel to victory over the Canaanites. Every time, whenever they followed the Lord's procedure, they were given victory. And on the few times they failed to follow God's battle plans, they suffered humiliating defeats, reminding them that it was by God's power that these victories were made possible. When the war was won, Joshua and the new high priest divided the land by tribal allotment. Joshua gave a farewell speech encouraging faithfulness to God, just as Moses, his mentor, had done. And this glowing report is given at the end of the book. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua 24 and verse 31. Now, the conquest of Canaan raises a difficult question for many Bible readers. Why did God command Israel to kill the tribes who lived in Canaan and take their land? I think the answer to this question is fairly simple, but it might be difficult for some of us to accept. Remember back in the days of Noah, the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. Genesis 6 and verse 11. God responded to this superabundance of evil with the devastation of the flood. Centuries later, God told Abraham that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was great and that their sins were grievous before the Lord. And God responded to that superabundance of evil by destroying those cities using fire and brimstone as his means of devastation in Genesis 19 and verse 29. God is the sovereign judge of the universe, and God has seen what happens when humans rule according to their own wisdom, and they fill the earth with chaos, violence, and destruction. That's the whole function of Genesis 3 through 11. What happens when humans judge and rule on their own terms? What happens when humans follow their own wisdom and reject the reign of God? They bring nothing but chaos, violence, and devastation into God's good world. So God judged those heathen Canaanites who were wholly corrupt, who were practicing things like child sacrifice in service to their false gods, and he deemed it was time for them to be destroyed. But instead of using floodwaters or fire and brimstone, God chose as his instrument of judgment the sword of Israel. God's justice was against the tribes of Canaan. And I want to make sure that I emphasize that this act of divine judgment had nothing to do with their ethnicity. Sometimes I hear people depict this as ethnic cleansing. The Lord demonstrated that this was not about ethnicity at the very beginning of the invasion, when the God-fearing Canaanite Rahab turned from her previous heathenism to serve the Lord, and she and her family were spared from that devastation that befell her city, the city of Jericho, and they were accepted into the covenant family of God. He told the Israelites that if they ever went the way of the Canaanites, if they ever turned to the kind of evil and violence and idolatry that he was judging the Canaanites and condemning them for committing, that he would do the same to them. God didn't choose Israel because they were mightier, more noble, more ethnically pure, or even more righteous than any other people groups. He chose them because of Abraham, because of the promises that he made to the patriarchs. We read, "The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments." Deuteronomy 7 through 9. The promised land itself is a powerful biblical theme. It was one of the three main promises God made to Abraham. Its borders were carefully outlined by the Lord. The tribal boundaries were meticulously drawn by Joshua. It was intended to be a new Eden of bounty, peace, and rest. But, like the terms of the Mosaic covenant, the land had to be kept. And that means that the goodness of the land was intrinsically tied to the loyalty of the people. If they rejected God, the land would reject them. If they defiled the land with iniquity and unrighteousness and idolatry, the land would spit them or vomit them out. If they deprived God, the land would not yield its bounty to them. If they rebelled against God, the land would reject them, and into exile they would eventually go. This period of Israelite history represents the highs and lows of their entire existence. At Sinai, the people pledged their unyielding fidelity to God and the covenant, but then they worshiped the golden calf and rejected God's plan to take Canaan. The Israelite priests were ordained, and when they ministered in the holy place, God's glory filled it, and everything was filled with wonder and splendor. But then Nadab and Abihu brought unauthorized fire into the presence of God, and they were struck dead. After the low point of the wilderness wandering, they reached new heights under Joshua, taking the promised land with God's miraculous power. But we can ask the question, how long will the good times last? Well, the next book, the book of Judges, tells us not long at all. Conquest and the Promised Land, like our previous studies, teaches us some incredibly insightful themes. We've learned that God is a warrior who fights with his people and gives them great victories. We've learned about the nature of sacrifice, that these sacrifices were reminders of the dreadfulness of sins, and they provided the means by which God would make atonement for his wayward people. We learned about priests, who are special ministers set apart for sacred service in God's holy presence. Of course, Adam and Eve were designated as priests in God's sacred temple of the Garden of Eden, but now the Levites are given that responsibility. We've learned a little bit about unbelief. This is simply a lack of trust in God's ways, which was manifested for Israel in their disobedience to God's instructions. And unbelief manifests itself in the same way even today. And finally, we learned a bit about the Promised Land, God's sacred space, set aside for his people to enjoy the Edenic blessings of peace and rest and fellowship with him. God gave Israel everything they needed to be successful in their service to him. He delivered them from bondage and gave them divine guidance through the terms of the covenant. He dwelt among them in the tabernacle and provided them a system of sacrifice and worship to commune with him, to be reconciled with him when they sin. He guided them into the precipice of the promised land and told them all they had to do was follow his plan. But they rejected that plan, and they died in the desert as a result. Now, thankfully, the next generation was up for the task, and they succeeded where their parents had failed. The people of God, of course, have the same assurance from the Lord today as what Joshua was given so long ago. For Hebrews 13:5 says, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." So let us be strong and courageous in the Lord, because 1 Corinthians 15:57 reminds us, "Thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ."